Shona Castleton was born in 1966 in Salt Lake City, located in the state of Utah, United States of America. She had an older sister named Paula, with whom she maintained a very close relationship throughout her entire life. In 1994, when Shona turned 28, she decided to move to her dream city of Las Vegas, a city that embodied endless opportunities for a young girl. Shona's first steps in her new home were as a saleswoman in a cosmetic store, but deep down she aspired for something greater. She was drawn to the vibrant nightlife of Las Vegas, filled with money, success, and luxury. Shona's dream came true when she landed a job as a waitress at one of the most prestigious casinos in the city, the Palms. Her striking appearance and outgoing personality helped Shona quickly settle into her new workplace and forge friendships with her colleagues, who became like a second family to her. She was always smiling, radiant, and in a wonderful mood. Due to her blonde hair, beautiful looks, and beaming smile, her friends affectionately called her Barbie. Shona adored her job, and the customers, in turn, adored her. The young woman's earnings reached around $100,000 per year, which was quite an impressive achievement. But the Palms Casino gifted Shona not only with friends and financial prosperity but also with the love of her life. It was here in 2002 that she met George Tiaffay, her future husband. It was true love at first sight. George was an incredibly attractive, charismatic, and charming man. At the time of their meeting, he worked as a firefighter and had dedicated his life to helping people. George deeply valued his family and sent money home every month to support his mother, who was caring for his younger sister with a disability. Photos of George, thanks to his appealing appearance, were even featured in firefighter calendars. Together, he and Shona made a remarkably beautiful, vibrant couple, filled with sincere feelings for each other. After their very first date, the lovers became inseparable and soon began living together. A year later, their baby girl was born, whom they named Madison. For Shona, little Madison became the true meaning of life. She devoted herself to raising her daughter and taking care of the household, while her husband continued working as a firefighter. 3 years later, the couple decided to legalize their relationship and exchanged vows of loyalty in Hawaii, on the picturesque ocean shore. It was a touching, warmth-filled ceremony attended only by their closest loved ones. It seemed like their life resembled a real fairy tale. But unfortunately, this story would not have a happy ending. 2 years after the wedding, problems began in the family. George experienced financial difficulties and lost a significant amount of money in the real estate market. Shona had to return to work to become the main breadwinner of the family. Her husband, grappling with failures, almost stopped working and fell into depression. He was uncomfortable in this situation, but at that time he could not cope with the financial hardships. George started expressing dissatisfaction with his wife's appearance at work. He was against her revealing outfits and began exhibiting jealousy. But Shona could not dress differently, as it was required by the specifics of her job. The tension between the spouses grew. The situation worsened even more when George befriended a homeless man and started inviting him over to their home. Shona found this man eerie and he frightened her. Previously, George had helped the homeless, but he had never brought them into their house. Now, he had crossed that line. Shona was extremely exhausted by her husband's behavior and could no longer tolerate it. So for the sake of her own safety and that of her daughter, after almost 10 years of living together, she moved out from George into a separate apartment in a townhouse complex. This breakup became a true emotional shock for Shona. Her loved ones saw how deeply she was grieving over the collapse of her family. But by nature, the woman was an optimist and hoped that she would be able to save her marriage. George, too, was against divorce. The couple tried to preserve their family and even started seeing a family therapist. But unfortunately, it yielded no results. Too many mutual resentments and grievances had accumulated between them. Therefore, Shona took the decisive step and filed for divorce. The former spouses began battling for custody of their daughter in court. To somehow distract herself from the family troubles, Shona immersed herself in work. The only bright moments in her life were communicating with her daughter and her beloved job. But one day in early September 2012, upon returning from work, the woman noticed that someone had been in her house. Everywhere was in disarray, some valuable items were missing, including her wedding ring. But the strangest thing was that in addition to the valuables, the thief had also taken her bikini. Instead, he left a pair of men's boxer shorts of a small size in the apartment. This was extremely unusual and not at all similar to an ordinary burglary, as the police believed. Shona was frightened by this invasion of her personal space but decided not to escalate the situation and tried to forget about everything. However, the cruel irony of fate was that just 3 weeks later, an unknown person visited her home again. And this time, his visit had much more terrifying consequences. On September 29, 2012, Shona left work as usual, around 3 o'clock in the morning. At 3:30, she parked her car in the garage near her house and entered the apartment. After that, no one ever saw her alive again. In the morning, after finishing his shift, George went to his mother's house to pick up their 8-year-old daughter Madison, who had spent the night at her grandmother's, and together with the girl, he headed to his ex-wife's apartment to get some things for the child. The doors of Shona's house were suspiciously open, as were the doors of the apartment itself. Upon entering, they saw that the place was in disarray, things were scattered about, and on the floor in a pool of blood lay the lifeless body of the owner. Stunned by the horrific discovery, George immediately called 911 and summoned the police. Soon, law enforcement officers were at the crime scene. From the nature of the injuries, it was clear that the attack on Shona was particularly brutal. Her skull was so severely and deeply crushed that the medics initially assumed it was a gunshot wound, but the forensic expert established the true cause of death: the woman had been beaten to death with a hammer. The bones of her fingers were broken, indicating her desperate attempts to defend herself from the attacker, which unfortunately proved futile. The unknown assailant savagely beat his victim until she stopped showing any signs of life. In total, 17 hammer blows were counted on the body of the deceased. The first suspect was Shona's ex-husband, George. After all, it was he who discovered the body of the deceased, and the couple was in the process of divorcing at the time. However, it soon became clear that George had an ironclad alibi. At the time of the crime, he was at work, having completed a 24-hour shift, which was confirmed by his colleagues and surveillance camera footage. So the man had to be excluded from the circle of suspects. One of the neighbors informed the investigators that on the night in question, he had heard some suspicious sounds coming from Shona's apartment but did not attach much significance to it, as the woman often returned home late. Another neighbor came across the victim's driver's license, phone, and cosmetics and handed these findings over to the police. The detectives recalled that shortly before the murder, someone had broken into Shona's apartment, stealing some valuables and leaving men's underwear there. This incident seemed extremely strange to the cops, so they decided to examine this lead more closely. Given the striking appearance of the deceased, it was quite possible that she had acquired an obsessed admirer who began stalking her. This could also explain the disappearance of Shona's bikini. Or perhaps she accidentally became the victim of a burglar who broke into her home at an inopportune time, and when the owner unexpectedly returned, he had to get rid of the unwanted witness. This could explain why Shona's personal belongings were found near the house. The thief could have thrown them out while fleeing the crime scene with the stolen valuables. But as it turned out, no valuables were missing from the apartment, which cast doubt on the version of a failed robbery. Shona's brutal murder shocked and frightened her colleagues. They feared that the maniac who might have been stalking the woman could now come after them as well. Investigators carefully studied the surveillance camera footage from her workplace to find out if any outsiders had appeared there or if anyone had been following Shona. But nothing suspicious was noticed on the video. So this lead also proved fruitless. Upon learning about the tragedy from the police, the victim's sister, Paula, along with her husband, urgently flew to Las Vegas, supposedly to help with the investigation. But in reality, she believed that everything was much simpler. The woman immediately told the cops that she knew who was behind this crime and expressed suspicions about George. In her opinion, Shona's ex-husband had either committed the murder himself or hired someone to do it. In parallel, the police received information that a homeless man had allegedly blurted out how he had beaten a woman to death with a hammer. At first, no one paid attention to his ramblings, but when rumors about the brutal killing of Shona spread through the city, the vagrant's words were taken more seriously. The cops quickly tracked down this man. He turned out to be a certain Nowlin Stevens, who was found near a store where he often hid stolen food. During a search, drugs were found on Stevens, which was enough for an arrest. It turned out that he had previously had problems with the law due to minor offenses but categorically denied any involvement in the murder. Law enforcement officers visited the tent where Stevens lived, and finding it in the desert proved to be a difficult task. However, the search yielded results. Near Nowlin's dwelling, they found a pair of bloody jeans, which were sent to the lab. The examination results confirmed the investigators' worst fears. Traces of Shona's blood and the suspect's own DNA were found on the pants. In addition, a store receipt was found in the pocket of the jeans. After reviewing the surveillance camera footage from the time indicated on the receipt, the police established that it was Stevens who had paid cash for a hammer and boxer shorts. While studying Nowlin's phone records, the cops came across an interesting detail: the homeless man had contacted a subscriber named George 87 times. And this turned out to be none other than George Tiaffay, the murdered woman's ex-husband. It was revealed that Stevens was the same friend of George's who had frightened Shona when he visited the couple as a guest. The woman was not afraid of him for nothing and moved out from her husband precisely because of this. Nowlin confirmed to the investigators that the George from his contact list was his firefighter buddy. The police watched the store's camera recordings once more and noticed that Stevens had not arrived there alone but with some man in a car. The two of them walked around the sales floor and were selecting something. This companion of the homeless man was undoubtedly George Tiaffay. All the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Shona's ex-husband had persuaded his friend to help him get rid of his wife. According to the investigation's version, George assisted Nowlin in preparing for the crime. He informed him of when exactly Shona would return from work and chose the day of his own shift for the attack. In this way, he provided himself with an alibi and deflected suspicion from himself. George was certain that it was the perfect murder plan that would never be solved. But he had miscalculated fatally. The police presented Stevens with the evidence collected against him, and under pressure, the homeless man confessed to the crime. He confirmed that he had killed Shona at George's request, who wanted his wife dead and paid $600 for it. After completing the order, Tiaffay had allegedly promised his accomplice several more tens of thousands from the insurance he was to receive for his wife. Here it was, the true motive for the brutal crime: money. Nowlin recounted that he and George had carefully prepared for the murder and staged a robbery of Shona's home 3 weeks before her death for this purpose. The goal was singular: to confuse the investigation by throwing the detectives off the trail. Previously, during difficult moments in his life, George had repeatedly helped Nowlin, becoming his best friend. Therefore, when Tiaffay asked for a favor, the homeless man could not refuse him. Stevens described in detail what had really happened in Shona's house on that fateful day. Having a spare key from George, he snuck into the apartment when the owner was not at home, hid there, and waited for her return. Upon hearing the front door open, the killer put on a mask and lay in wait. After waiting for the victim to climb to the second floor, he jumped out of his hiding place and attacked Shona from behind, armed with a hammer. From the blow, the woman fell, and Nowlin pounced on her from above and began pounding her with his terrible weapon. Shona desperately resisted and screamed, "What for? Why are you doing this?" And when she saw the face of the attacker, she understood everything. But it was too late. Nowlin struck with such fury and force that the hammer broke. But this did not stop the enraged man. He grabbed the metal part and continued dealing blows until the unfortunate victim stopped breathing. Having beaten Shona to death, the killer fled, not even bothering to close the door behind him. Stevens showed the cops where he had hidden the murder weapon. The broken hammer was found near his tent. George's mother and sister were summoned for questioning and informed about their son's and brother's involvement in Shona's murder. The relatives refused to believe that George could have done such a thing. But the suspect's sister, upon learning from the police about the evidence collected against him, immediately called her brother and warned him that the cops would soon come for him. The man fell into despair. Having received alarming news from his sister that the police were about to come for him, George panicked. Gripped by despair, he jumped into his car and sped off at a frenzied speed, reaching over 100 kilometers per hour. But suddenly, his car at full speed rammed a road guardrail. The police officers who arrived at the scene of the accident assumed that George had actually tried to take his own life in this way. This version was supported by the absence of any brake marks before the collision. It seemed that the driver had deliberately directed his vehicle into an obstacle. Miraculously surviving the horrific crash, Tiaffay was taken to the hospital. And as soon as the doctors allowed his transportation, the man was arrested on charges of murdering his wife. To which he reacted with a laconic "okay." Soon, George Tiaffay and Nowlin Stevens were officially charged with the intentional murder of Shona. However, unlike his accomplice, who immediately cooperated with the investigation, George had no intention of confessing to the crime. Moreover, a gun purchased after his wife's death was found in his house. The detectives assumed that Tiaffay had actually planned to get rid of his homeless friend in order not to share the insurance money with him and also to remove a dangerous witness before the trial. Given the indisputable evidence of guilt and the confession of the accused himself, the trial of Nowlin Stevens was quick. Having made a deal with the investigation, he agreed to testify against George in exchange for the prosecutors not seeking the death penalty for him. As a result, Stevens received a life sentence with the right to parole after 42 years. On the other hand, the evidence base against George Tiaffay did not look as convincing. There were only circumstantial evidence and Nowlin's testimony. The prosecution understood that it was actually George who had manipulated his not-too-smart homeless friend, who was unlikely to have been able to plan and carry out such a crime on his own. But proving this was extremely difficult. In addition, Tiaffay had an experienced lawyer who masterfully played on the emotions of the jury, portraying his client as a hero firefighter, an exemplary family man who loved his wife and daughter above all else. The defense attorney claimed that Shona's murder was the work of Nowlin Stevens, who allegedly envied the couple's happiness and especially disliked the victim, who at the time of the tragedy was just divorcing his friend. Accordingly, George had nothing to do with it. The lawyer also emphasized that Stevens suffered from a mental illness and had a propensity for hallucinations, so his testimony should not be trusted. Convincing the jury of Tiaffay's guilt against the backdrop of such an emotional speech by the defense was not easy. The only weighty evidence was the surveillance camera footage from the store, which showed George together with Nowlin choosing the infamous hammer, as well as printouts of phone calls between the men. However, Tiaffay's lawyer tried to refute this as well, explaining everything by the ordinary friendly relationship between the client and Stevens, who often communicated, and the hammer was allegedly bought for household needs. It was striking that throughout the entire trial, George maintained a remarkably impassive demeanor, even when his former best friend testified against him. Tiaffay's relatives, colleagues, and friends unanimously insisted that he was a kind and gentle man who would never harm anyone. They simply could not believe that a loving father and exemplary family man was capable of orchestrating the murder of his own wife. But despite this, the jury found George guilty. 3 long years passed after the brutal killing of Shona before justice finally prevailed. The jury convicted George Tiaffay of conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree intentional homicide. The killer's relatives asked for leniency, but to no avail. The man was sentenced to the maximum severe punishment, life imprisonment without the right to early release. Upon hearing the verdict, George showed no emotion. Tiaffay's loved ones refused to believe in his guilt and disagreed with the court's decision. At the same time, Shona's family reacted to the news of her murderer's harsh punishment with relief, believing that life behind bars was exactly what the monster who took the life of their beloved daughter, sister, and niece deserved. Later, George Tiaffay filed an appeal, in which he claimed that his lawyer was incompetent, as he had ignored the defendant's mental health problems. Allegedly, George was taking some medications that clouded his mind, and because of this, he heard the voice of God, who supposedly ordered him to kill his wife for the sake of saving his daughter. And supposedly it was because of this divine call that the man committed the terrible crime. George also reproached his defender for not even trying to prove the client's need for a psychiatric examination at the time. However, the lawyer denied these accusations, stating that he was hearing about Tiaffay's mental issues for the first time. So the appeal was rejected. After her mother's tragic death, 11-year-old Madison was placed under the care of her grandmother, that is, Shona's mother. The girl is often visited by her Aunt Paula. The child misses her mom very much and frequently remembers her. For Madison, this is an irreparable loss that will accompany her throughout her entire life. That's all for now. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future content. Take care and goodbye.